Welcome back to PodBites. Today we're talking about something you're absolutely guaranteed to see in the NICU, the infant of a diabetic mother, or IDM. Let me paint the classic exam picture. A big newborn, maybe a difficult delivery, maybe the APGAR is not great, and suddenly you're thinking, wait, is this macrosomia and why? Probably maternal diabetes, right?
Exactly. Remember, normal term babies are usually around 3.5 kilos, but with maternal hyperglycemia, the baby gets exposed to extra glucose throughout pregnancy and responds with fetal hyperinsulinism. And insulin acts like a growth hormone. That's why these babies grow so much.
But we always hear that diabetic babies have congenital anomalies, metabolic problems, respiratory issues. It feels like everything goes wrong. Is there a way to organize that in our brains?
Yeah, think of timing. If the maternal diabetes is uncontrolled early in pregnancy, during organ development, we worry about congenital malformations, things like neural tube defects, caudal regression syndrome, and congenital heart disease, especially transposition of the gray arteries.
So early equals structural issues. And what about later?
Later, in the second and third trimester, the story is all about hyperinsulinism. So here we get macrosomia, shoulder dystocia that might cause Erb's palsy, polycythemia, neonatal hypoglycemia, electrolyte imbalances like low calcium and magnesium, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, hyperbilirubinemia, and even breathing problems like NRDS.
So the same diabetes causes different problems depending on when it's uncontrolled. That actually makes the whole picture make sense. Okay, so baby is born, looks big. What's the first thing I should be looking for at the bedside?
I'm thinking about glucose right away, and then bilirubin, electrolytes, and don't forget the heart, because we have congenital lesions or even hypertrophic cardiomyopathy simply from insulin exposure.
So even if the baby looks fine, we're doing an echo?
Absolutely, because sometimes they compensate until suddenly they can't.
Alright, now the big one, hypoglycemia. Walk me through the actual numbers because exams love this.
If the glucose is under 30 milligrams per deciliter in the first 24 hours, or under 40 milligrams per deciliter after the first day, that is considered hypoglycemia.
And do we just jump straight into IV glucose?
Not always. If the baby is asymptomatic, we try oral feeds. But if they're symptomatic, jittery, hypotonic, lethargic, then we go straight to IV dextrose. And if we can't get IV access and the baby looks obtunded, we think glucagon.
So feeding early is not just nice, it's actual treatment.
Exactly, which is why we encourage mothers to start breastfeeding immediately.
And while all this is happening, I should be thinking about what else?
Birth defects, respiratory issues, electrolytes, and oxygen if needed. These babies need a global assessment, not just a glucose check.
I love how this comes together. Early uncontrolled diabetes damages formation. Later, uncontrolled diabetes causes metabolic overload. So the infant of a diabetic mother isn't just a big baby. They're a baby with neurologic, cardiac, metabolic, and respiratory vulnerabilities.
Exactly. Macrosomia is just the tip of the iceberg.
That's such a great way to remember it. Before we finish episode 4, let's test ourselves again. What drives macrosomia in the infant of a diabetic mother? And second, what classic congenital abnormality is associated with diabetic embryopathy? Think about those while we recap. We begin with the infant of diabetic mother, reminding ourselves that maternal hyperglycemia causes fetal hyperinsulinism, and that insulin acts like a growth hormone.
Which explains macrosomia and the increased risk of shoulder dystocia at birth, as well as severe neonatal hypoglycemia right after birth once the placental glucose supply is suddenly cut off.
We also highlighted that uncontrolled diabetes in early pregnancy can cause diabetic embryopathy, with the classic example being caudal regression syndrome.
Management focuses on close glucose monitoring and early feeding, and sometimes IV dextrose in symptomatic hypoglycemia. Prevention really starts with good maternal glycemic control.
And remember the long-term risks. These infants are at higher risk of metabolic problems later in life.
So, macrosomia is driven by fetal hyperinsulinism.
And caudal regression syndrome is the classic congenital complication.
And that wraps up episode 4.
In the next episode, we'll discuss neonatal jaundice. See you there.